hashtag WOACB, hashtag wolf receipts, hashtag lady wolves, hashtag zero fucks, hashtag fuck them clowns spelt differently, hashtag facts, hashtag drama, hashtag JK, like JAYKAY, hashtag beautiful Tammy Sue, hashtag KJ, hashtag hilarious.
Red nose, big grin.
He spelled hilarious wrong.
Too huge and a
He
pie
said
on his chin.
HILARIOU and you forgot
He tripped
S.
on his own hat, then he bowed so proud.
Hashtag
Like,
funny.
how about that?
Hashtag
He went
truth
ta-da,
seekers.
then he
Hashtag
lost his
oops.
wig. I
Hashtag
laughed
men
so hard I
too.
dropped my
Hashtag
zigzag.
Manahawk. Hashtag rebel fox with two X's. Hashtag EKC people suck. Hashtag Veda gay. Hashtag say it. Hashtag KIAL. Hashtag Maya. Hashtag courage. Hashtag Bell. Hashtag just trying to fit in, but it doesn't have two T's. It just has one T. Yeah. Hashtag taboo topics. Hashtag sister Reagan. Hashtag sister April. Hashtag Madam Matriarch Heather. Hashtag the ninjas. Hashtag ninja Deb. Hashtag the Hawks. Hashtag Hawks spelled HAUCKS. Hashtag the lioness. Hashtag anti-KJ. Hashtag Wolf News Network. Hashtag EKC. Hashtag Steve. Hashtag Mr. Blackwolf. Again. Hashtag Carly. Hashtag oh my god, it's a repeat. Hashtag KIAL. Hashtag Maya. Hashtag Curly. Hashtag Pup Curly. Hashtag Pup the Clown. Hashtag Madam Matriarch. Hashtag Wolfgun Family. Hashtag Lady Wolf. Hashtag Megan. Hashtag Beautiful Tammy Sue. Hashtag Taboo Topics. Hashtag Reagan. Hashtag Wolf News Network. Hashtag Facts. Hashtag WOACB. Hashtag anti-KJ. Hashtag the real anti-KJs. Hashtag, okay, so now we're not in the repeat anymore. Hashtag live stream. Hashtag short video. Hashtag shorts video. Shorts video. Hashtag shorts video again. Twice. Hashtag trending shorts. Hashtag YouTube shorts. Hashtag trending. Hashtag pro wrestling. Hashtag IWT. Hashtag WWE. Hashtag AEW. Hashtag NJPW. Hashtag WWNXT. Hashtag WWE Raw. Hashtag Saka. This is why he gets in trouble. This is against terms of service. If the video is not about this shit, it's not supposed to be in the hashtag. Hashtag Royal Rumble. Hashtag AEW Dynamite. Hashtag Wolfden Families again. Hashtag GCW. Hashtag Wolfnet News Network again. Hashtag Pro Wrestling again. Hashtag WWE. Hashtag WAE. Hashtag again and again. Hashtag NJPW. Hashtag WWE Raw. Hashtag short video again. Hashtag Lady Wolves again. Hashtag Fuck the Clowns again. Hashtag Zero Fucks. Hashtag Biggie Bass. Hashtag Cry Louder. Hashtag Wolf Receipts. Hashtag AI Art. Hashtag AI Artist. Hashtag AI Art Community. Hashtag JK. Again, this is all repeated. Hashtag Fuck them Clowns. Hashtag Wolf News Network for the fourth time. Hashtag facts. Hashtag AI Artist again. Hashtag beautiful Tammy Sue. Hashtag KJ. Hashtag funny. Hashtag confused. Hashtag fictional drama. Oh, at least I guess they know it's fictional. Hashtag uh-oh. Hashtag hilarious. Spelled correct.
Uh-oh.
Hashtag funny again. Hashtag truth. Hashtag fictional drama again. Hashtag 90 Day Fiance. Hashtag me too, men too again. Hashtag Manahawk again. Hashtag Rebel Fox. Hashtag EKC. Hashtag JDF Beta Jade. Hashtag Fate. Hashtag Fire again. Hashtag Maya again. Hashtag Carly again. Hashtag Bell. Hashtag just try to fit in. Hashtag Curly. Hashtag 420 Splash. That's a new one. Hashtag Taboo Tapper. Hashtag Mr. Flash again. Hashtag Sister Reagan. Hashtag Sister April. Hashtag Madam Matriarch Heather. Hashtag Ninjas. Hashtag Ninja Dead. Hashtag the Hawks. Hashtag Lioness. Hashtag KJ. Hashtag AKJ. Hashtag WOCB. Hashtag Lady Wolves. Hashtag Wolfman Family again. Hashtag short videos and short video. video, hashtag live, hashtag live stream, hashtag wrestling, hashtag PC, hashtag Steve, hashtag Mr. Wackwolf for the 5th time, hashtag Aunt Carly, hashtag Katie's a liar again, hashtag Maya again, hashtag Chloe, hashtag fuck that clown, hashtag Mad Matriarch, hashtag Wolfgang Family, hashtag Lady Wolf, hashtag Veda, hashtag Beautiful Tammy Sue, hashtag Happy Topic, hashtag Reagan, hashtag Wolf News Network, hashtag Facts, hashtag WOCD, hashtag anti-KJ, hashtag the real anti-KJs, hashtag shorts videos, hashtag short feeds, hashtag shorts video, hashtag trending shorts, hashtag YouTube shorts. Then in all capitals it says like video streams are not for inept fucking racist or children, clowns, turncoat, flip-floppers, again, because it says that also right there. Hashtag a video, and then we start again from the top. Hashtag on video, hashtag AI art, hashtag AI artist, hashtag black wolf, hashtag art community, or AI art community, hashtag AI artist community, hashtag film, hashtag fuck them sounds, hashtag cry louder, hashtag biggie bad, hashtag wolf and family, hashtag with WOACD, hashtag wolf receipts, hashtag baby wolves, hashtag zero fuck them sounds, hashtag facts, hashtag drama, hashtag JK, hashtag beautiful Tammy Sue, hashtag JJ, hashtag hilarious, spelled correctly, hashtag Tony, hashtag sweet, hashtag food. Hashtag Men2, hashtag Manhawk, hashtag Rebel Fun, the number 8, hashtag AJ, hashtag Fate, hashtag KIAL, hashtag Maya, hashtag Kelly, hashtag Bell, hashtag just try to fit in, hashtag Curly, hashtag Happy Comic, hashtag American Sister Reagan, hashtag her sister April, hashtag Madam Matriarch Heather, hashtag the Ninjas, hashtag Ninja Dev, hashtag the Hawk, hashtag Lion, hashtag Lioness, hashtag anti-KJ, hashtag Wolf News Network, hashtag EKC, hashtag Steve, hashtag Mr. Blackwell, hashtag Scarlet, hashtag KIAL, hashtag Maya, hashtag Pearly, hashtag Fuck the Clowns, hashtag Madam Matriarch Heather, hashtag Wolf and Family, hashtag Lady Wolves, hashtag Veda, hashtag Beautiful Tammy, hashtag Tabby Tabby, no, hashtag Reagan, hashtag Wolf News Network, hashtag Facts, hashtag WOACD, hashtag anti-KDJ, hashtag the real anti-KJ, hashtag live stream, hashtag shorts video, hashtag shorts feed, hashtag trending shorts. The end. Oh my god.
You wanna know how many they are?
How many were there?
246. You're welcome.
Fucking hinged.